All right. Welcome, everybody, to this wonderful Wednesday here with Mentorability Alberta. My name's Susanna Tawes, and I am the Southern Regional Project Lead for Mentorability here in Alberta. I'm very pleased and honored to have Jessica Barillo, sorry. I'm still working on my pronunciations. Even us in the sector can have those things happen to us as well, to join us today. She is the Regional Outreach Coordinator for Elections Canada. She is a member of the Inspire Democracy team seeking to reduce barriers for electors with disabilities, Indigenous electors, New Canadians, and other equity-seeking groups. She's going to be talking to us today about running as a candidate in the federal election, which is very exciting. So just before we start going over our land acknowledgement, we'd like to acknowledge that the Mentorability operates on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples in what is colonially called Alberta, and express gratitude and respect for the land we use. On our decolonial journey, we pledge to dismantle systematic racism within our organization and commit to advancing reconciliation and equitable partnerships as we continue to engage predominantly in Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 territories and the Métis homeland. We recognize that acknowledgement of traditional land is a start, but what is being asked for by Indigenous communities is land back. Would like to take this opportunity for everyone to take a moment and just recognize where you're joining from and your relationship with the land, as well as our Indigenous neighbors and nations in our communities. For today, a little bit of housekeeping. We ask that everyone stays muted during the presentation and the chat. There will be time afterwards for questions and answers, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. So if you have a comment or a question that you just need to get out there, feel free to type that in there. And also to know that closed captioning is available on the Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. Just a little bit about Mentorability for those who may not know. We are a national initiative that supports people experiencing PAN disabilities, which also includes neurodiversity, anxiety, chronic illnesses, explore different career pathways, and connect with different networks to help them in their journey and career paths. We also work with employers to help them in their inclusion journeys and get to know other people in the PAN disability community. One of the big benefits for employers is to gain knowledge, tools, and a supportive network, as well as to realize that there's a huge pool of very talented people experiencing disabilities ready and willing and able to work. For job seekers, we create those connections and have different experiences such as today to learn about careers and jobs. And then also we work with supported employment service providers across the province to create that network of supports, learning, and connections. And also to strengthen employer relationships. So that being said, I'm going to stop the share for now, and I'm going to welcome Jessica once again and turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and hello, everybody. I am located here in Amiskwacy, Waskahigan, also known as Edmonton. So over the next hour or so, please feel free to move around or multitask as you like. You can have your cameras on or off. You can stim. I like to think that I would be a big old hypocrite if I were out here advocating for inclusive spaces, but I wasn't open to people participating in these programs in different ways. So please go for it. I will also say that in addition to talking about running as a candidate, I will also welcome questions or comments about the kind of behind the scenes of this presentation. If you're curious about what it's like to work for Elections Canada or an outreach in general, I'm a person with a disability myself, and I'm pretty passionate about seeing representation everywhere I go, including in elections. And also, Susanna, we have a teaching moment, which is I made a mistake. So I provided the presentation a week in advance because I know sometimes it's handy for folks to go over it in advance. And I sent the wrong presentation. So I'm going to send out my apologies. The presentation that if you happen to be following along on your end is not going to be the same as the one I'm about to show you. Yeah, Mike. And I didn't realize until like an hour ago. So here we are. That being said, though, I will do my best to go through the material slowly. I also read all of the words that are on the slides. So if you use a screen reader or need that additional help, I will be sure to read all of that. And along with a resource sheet that I'll be sending out to Susanna to send out to you afterwards, uh, she will also send out the updated presentation so you can review it. So my apologies and thank you for your patience with that. That being said, let's get into it. I will share my screen from the beginning. So here we are, to removing barriers to running in a federal election. So this will be as a candidate. So our agenda today, I will go over icebreaker. I'd like to get to know you folks who are here, especially since we have a nice small group, and I will talk about our objectives for the session. But then it is split up into 4 sections. The first of which is when you are thinking about becoming a candidate, everything you need to know then. The second section is becoming a candidate. Once you've thought about it, and then you're like, I'm indeed going to do it. Then the third section is what you need to do when you are a candidate. And then the fourth section is some electoral security, so some safeguards that we have in place to maintain the integrity of the Canadian electoral system. And then, of course, the conclusion. So first, I'm going to read this out and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you if anybody chooses to turn your camera on. But I would love to go around and do a bit of an icebreaker. So I would, if you feel like sharing, you can either put it in the chat or you can feel free to unmute. If you want to turn your camera on, you can. But I would love to know your name, where you're tuning in from, and have you ever run for anything before? This could be a municipal office, student council, maybe, community associations or groups, board committees, anything like this. And I would love to know if you have, what your experience is. And if you haven't, that's a-okay because you've come to the right place. So I will stop sharing now. And I'm going to come back to you because otherwise I feel too disconnected. Oh, I see. And Susanna put it in the chat. So, for example, my name is Jessica. I'm from Edmonton, and I am the chair of the the Edmonton Heritage Council, and I had to run to get that position. And my experience was that it was actually pretty intimidating and a little scary, but I was very proud because even if I lost, I would think, you know what, I made this a more ethical place because it meant that the people who voted had multiple chairs to choose from. So I see, Mike, you have your hand up. Hello.
Yeah, hi. My name is Mike Wing. I am from Edmonton, and I am a disability rights advocate. I've been involved with Gateway. I'm on the Gateway board of directors. Um, and I've never run for office. I've had a lot of people in my life tell me that I should run for office. Um,
Mm,
which is what kind of sort of why Jamie invited me to come to the session back at the Gateway Christmas party. Um, but most of what holds me back, there's a few things. Um, Number one is I feel like there's a lot of ableism in politics, especially around language and how policies the language of policies and bills and just how you have to conduct yourself when in the legislature, the House of Commons, whatever it might be. And I think that's the biggest thing that held me back. The other thing being that I am a diehard Democratic Socialist, and I feel like I would struggle to be in a room with people that are deeply against that idea.
mm, mm. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. Well, hopefully, if you ever do decide to run, some of this information might become helpful to you. But yeah, I understand that being in the situation where you are up against people who might have the opposite of values of you, that can be, oof, yeah.
Yeah.
Does anyone else like to share or say hi? You don't have to, but you're welcome to. Okay. That's a-okay. I'm happy to have you all here regardless.
We
Oh,
have
yes.
one
Oh,
comment in the chat, if
Oh,
that's okay.
thank you.
Yeah, from Dean. My name is Dean, he slash they. I've run for a board vice chair position for a 2S LGBTQIA plus organization. I did win this position, but I agree that it was quite intimidating and nerve-wracking. Thank you for
Mm,
sharing, Dean.
yeah, thank you. And it's nice to know I wasn't alone on those feelings, but good to have you here. Anybody else?
I can share that I ran, and it was a little bit of a default run, but I did run for a co-chair position of my kids' old preschool, and it was intimidating because no one else was standing up to the position.
Oh,
And so put my hand up, and I was like, I'd like to do this, but I don't think I can do it on my own. And then there was another parent there that also put up their hand. And so we were able to do it together, which really helped the experience knowing that you had someone who was going through the same experience.
oh yeah. That's nice that you guys were able to work together on it. Very cool. Thanks for sharing. All right, well, I'm going to get back into my presentation. And if you decide you want to share later, that's okay. Just put it in the chat and Susanna will interrupt me, and that's totally fine. But I'm going to continue on at this time. Here we go. Oh, where did we end? There, that's where we ended. So my objectives of this presentation is first to demystify the process of running as a candidate in a federal election. Two, to show you what the steps to take to run as a candidate and also to help you realize what skills and resources are involved in running a campaign. And three, to give you an understanding of outreach strategies and effective ways to connect with voters. So the first section is when you are just thinking about becoming a candidate, which if you have come to this presentation, maybe this is the stage you are at right now. But in this section, I will go over the Canadian electoral system really briefly, also what to consider when becoming a candidate, and a little bit on finances and accessibility. So first, we're going to start off by hearing Selena talk about her experiences in running as a candidate in the federal election.
I'm not sure if it was a viable path. It just wasn't presented as an option. So we had, the typical immigrant family, and I don't mean to typecast all immigrant families, but doctor, lawyer, accountant, bank, like whatever those top five are. There's always five. Politician is never really on that top five. I don't know of anyone who came as from an immigrant family who's ever said, yeah, and politician. So politics was never really discussed as a career option. We'd say to my dad that he should run as a thing to do, but not as a like that would be his job. And what did that even mean as a job anyway? So we went back to my campaign team. We suspended the campaign for a day, went back to the team and said, look, I'm not a typical politician. We know that. What I do know is how to win. And what we're going to do is look at October 19th. And that's what do we want on October 19th? We want the win. How do we get the win? Mapped out. We need X amount of votes. How many doors do we need to knock on to get those amount of votes? This amount of doors. Where do we want to put our signs? What do we want them to say? What do we say in these different areas of Whitby? Because central Whitby is different from the periphery, is different from Brooklyn, is different from Southern 41. What's our messaging? So we really had a CEO who was selling the brand, which was me. Then we had a chief marketing officer who strategically placed the signs and figured out what the comms looked like. We had a human resources manager who managed every single volunteer that walked in, gave them a job based on their skill, not the fact that we needed people to put out signs. So, we had little kids who were bilingual who were tutoring me in French for half an hour because that was their skill. So we used that skill. So we had all of these things like you would structure a business. And then I said to them, if we wake up on October 20th and the results are not what we want, in my head I was thinking I will not go into a depression for 2 months. But I said to them, I will be fine because I knew we ran this campaign the best way that we knew how. And it's all of those things that you tell people when you're giving these motivational speeches. Use all of your skills and experience to be in your job, and you forget those when you get to your job. But that's actually what I needed to do for myself.
Nope. I also just really like the music in those videos. It's very inspiring. I never get sick of it. Don't tell my colleagues because they do get sick of that music. So now I'll go into the Canadian electoral system. So all of Canada is split up into 343 electoral districts. They're all based on population size. So some districts might be a very large geographic area that have a lower population density, or they might be a very small geographic area with a higher population density. So a city, for example, might have several electoral districts in it. And candidates run for a certain electoral district, and the winner ultimately will go on to represent that riding in the House of Commons. So the candidate who gets the most votes, they often do it with less than 50% of the votes because there'll be, say, more than two candidates in each electoral district. The political party that wins the most seats in the House of Commons usually forms the government. And then the leader of that political party becomes the prime minister. So I always like to mention this because no one in Canada runs for prime minister, so to speak, but rather if you represent a party or if you run independently, which we'll talk about later, you're running to represent a certain portion of the government within a very large group of people that run the country together. If the winning political party has more than half the seats in the House of Commons, we call this a majority government. But currently, we are actually in a minority government. And this means that, as we like to say in Elections Canada, the soup is getting hot. So that means a snap election could occur at any time. However, elections with a fixed date usually happen every 4 years. So if a snap election is not called, the election must happen before or on October 20th of this year. So however you shake it, the election is coming. When running as a candidate, you'll need to decide whether to run as a candidate of a political party or run as an independent. I will talk a little bit more about this a little later on. But running for office is about making a difference in your community and addressing local issues. It gives you a platform to highlight the issues that matter the most to you. You think about whether you can develop the skills necessary for public service. This is your opportunity to represent your values in public policy and law. So now, a true or false question. You can feel free to write down in the chat or even just think to yourself, true or false. You do not need to live in the riding where you are running as a candidate. What do we think? Feel free to think it to yourself, or if you put it in the chat, I'll make Susanna read them out to me because I can't see them.
Sure thing. So far, we have one true.
This is where I need to get some Jeopardy music.
Dun, 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 dun. I'm not sure. I have to say for myself, I've definitely made an assumption that you have to be in the writing.
Well, I'll put you all out of your misery The answer is false. You can run as a candidate in only one electoral district, but it doesn't have to be the electoral district where you live. And actually, this happened when I lived in Drumheller. So, Drumheller, smaller community than where I live now. And the candidate at the time in that election for the NDP party, they did not live in Drumheller. They actually lived in Calgary at the time. Yeah, but they were running in the Drumheller district.
Okay. And
Yes.
Mike's also said to think about Nenshi in that example.
Oh, yes. Oh, Nenchi. Yeah, thanks for that, Mike.
Yeah. And just before
Okay.
we move on, Mike did
Mhm.
have a question of when you were talking about those pieces on the previous slide, if this is different from other places.
Which this
Sorry,
the
one more before. Yeah,
electoral
this one right here.
system?
Yeah.
Yes, it is different from other places. So, very notably, our government is set up rather different from our southern neighbors in the States. And so, you might notice from some of the rhetoric, since we just went through an American election, or we witnessed an American election, that in that case, they run for president. So, they don't necessarily have multiple parties, although they kind of represent two schools of thought. Where in Canada, our government is actually made up of hundreds and hundreds of people. So if we have 343 electoral districts in Canada, that's 343 members of parliament that sit in our House of Commons. Not to mention that we also have people that are appointed by the prime minister and people that are appointed by the king. So it ends up being a system where there's a lot of people that are working together to make decisions. And then there's other countries of the world where it might be a smaller group of people, or it might ultimately come down to one person that has ultimate authority in those systems. So yes, this is can be very different than other countries, even other Commonwealth countries.
I'm still a bit confused on that, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, if you want to chat too at the end, Mike, I'll stick around and we
Sure,
can talk all you like about it. Does that sound
sure.
okay?
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for asking, though. Where are we? Here we go. So, running as a party candidate has several advantages. This is if you're choosing to either run. So, a party candidate would be if you run on behalf of any of the parties. So, for example, the Liberals or the Conservatives or the NDPs or the People's Party of Canada, any of those. Or if you run independently, this means that you are not representing one of those candidates, or excuse me, one of those parties, but rather your own personal values. So, we'll talk about the differences between the two. So you will share a common vision with the party on how to govern, and you'll represent this vision locally. You'll also benefit from shared resources, a platform, and national recognition of a party brand. The party leader's goals of becoming prime minister can add momentum to your campaign. Additionally, the party's existing network of volunteers and donors and supporters, they may offer you time, financial support, and votes to help you. However, you're still expected to build your own network and fundraise and gain voter support. If elected, you'll work closely with party leadership and other members of the team with certain responsibilities and expectations to meet. And so, to become endorsed by a party, each of the parties have a different process that you have to go through in order for them to endorse you. So, the best thing to do would be to go to the party website or reach out to your local member of parliament and see if you can find more information that way. On the other hand, running as an independent candidate comes with both challenges and freedoms. So you'll need to build your team from scratch, find your volunteers, raise donations, and identify your stance on various issues. You'll also need to secure resources and expertise to run your campaign effectively. If you win, you won't have a party caucus to rely on for support, but there won't be any party expectations on how you should act. So, as an independent, you are a free agent and can operate without any party constraints. So there's also strict rules around the financing of political campaigns before, during, and after an election. And I will say that this is also rules that are really unique to Canada compared to other countries as well. So all candidates have limits on how much money they can spend during an election, how much they can receive as political donations, how much they can contribute to their own campaign. So this means that candidates may have to fundraise, ask for donations from supporters. To encourage donations, though, you can issue official receipts for income tax purposes and political contributions. So I like to mention this because this is different than, say, other parts of the world. So some of these rules, they're helping to prevent people from having certain advantages just because they have more money. So this means that there's these caps are in place so that if there's somebody who's particularly wealthy and could fund their entire campaign on their own, they don't have that extra advantage of having a higher socioeconomic status than, say, other candidates. But when you run as a candidate, Elections Canada can reimburse some of your campaign expenses. So there are 6 categories of electoral campaign expenses. So one is election expenses. So this might be buying election signs and office supplies. 2 is your candidate's personal expenses, such as childcare, care for your disability, or the disability of a dependent. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. 3 is candidates' travel and living expenses, such as lodging and meals. 4 is candidates' litigation expenses. So if you call for a judicial recount, if you have extension requests, if you need to hire a lawyer for something, it falls under this category. 5 is accessibility expenses. So if you want to make your website accessible, if you want to get your documents made in accessible formats such as Braille or large print, those kind of expenses. And lastly is any other electoral campaign expenses such as renting an office outside of an election period. So the rules around political financing are included in the Canada Elections Act, which is this big act that governs everything about Canadian federal elections. But it also deals with matters like money received through contributions, loans, transfers, and fundraising activities, as well as your expenses. So when I could probably teach weeks and weeks of a course on this. So when I send out the resource sheet, there'll be additional links so you can, if you're particularly interested in what some of these rules are and some of these opportunities, you'll be able to read to your heart's content.
I'm going to pause you there, Jessica. This is so interesting. We have a question around this in terms of some of accessibility expenses possibly is can you get bills in plain language as part of this?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Sorry, I got really excited about that. So I am disappointed to say that I haven't personally heard about the Canada Elections Act being done in plain language. But what I will say is that the handbook that we have around this specifically about running as a candidate, that is in plain language. I really want to ask though,
Yeah,
because
that's a
I
great point.
I don't know everything, but it should be. Bills in plain language. I would love to, if you guys will permit me, I want to follow up with this with some of my colleagues afterwards. And Susanna, if it's okay with you, I'm going to send the answer along with the package of resources that I send after this because I would love to know. But I will say that the package of resources does include a link to the running as a candidate handbook that is in plain language.
Okay,
Does that
wonderful. The
hope
other
that
one, which
helps a little bit. Ooh, love that question.
such a good question, and makes me think a lot around other pieces in terms of how we communicate and understand government as well, and what's
Mhm.
available to us. There
I
was a
agree.
comment earlier around the independent versus with a party, and just kind of clarity that a way to think about running as an independent is almost like an entrepreneur or a sole proprietor.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it for sure. Yeah, it's, I like to think of it as kind of a branding that if you are in running independently, whatever it is that you personally value, you get to express that wholly and without any sort of like brand mitigation that would come from a party. Where if you run on behalf of a party, if you happen to have a differing opinion from the party that you run for, you might not necessarily be able to express that opinion or in that sense. You kind of have to follow the party platform. So you really want to choose a party that aligns with your values, I would suspect. But yeah, if you don't wholly align with that party, then you might not be free to go fully with what you think should happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hope that helps. Thanks for the questions. So one thing I do want to mention before I move away from financing is that if you identify as a person with a disability and you want to run as a federal candidate, then there's some expenses related to your disability that may be reimbursed by Elections Canada. So this is also known as the disability related personal expense, is like the fancy language that we call it. So all candidates could also be reimbursed for the expenses used to improve your campaign's accessibility for electors with a disability. So I'm going to go more into detail about that in this presentation because I thought that might be of special interest to you. So I will get there. But first, we'll go into section 2, so becoming a candidate. So you've thought about it and you're like, oh, am I going to be with a party? Am I going to run independently? What are my values? What do I want to do with this? And then let's say you decide to like pull the trigger. The time has come. You are going to become a candidate. Here's what you need to do. So first, I'm going to show you a little video to get us situated for this section.
So you're thinking about running as a candidate in the next federal election? This module explains the important first steps. You have a right to be a candidate if you are a Canadian citizen and at least 18 years old on election day. You can be a candidate for a registered party as long as you are officially endorsed by the party. Otherwise, you can run as an independent candidate. You don't have to live in the riding where you run for election. Before starting your campaign, you need to do a few things. You must appoint an official agent. You cannot accept contributions, loans, or transfers or incur expenses before this appointment is made. Your official agent must open a separate bank account to be used exclusively for the campaign. You can start accepting contributions as soon as you have an official agent and a campaign bank account. Providing receipts is mandatory, but you cannot issue tax receipts until after your nomination is confirmed by the returning officer. Let's talk a bit about the nomination process. You must file your nomination paper with the returning officer by 2 p.m. local time on the 21st day before Election Day. The nomination paper includes details about you, your official agent, and your auditor. You also have to provide the names, addresses, and signatures of at least 100 electors, or 50 in some ridings, consenting to your candidacy. File the nomination paper with the returning officer as early as possible, so there is enough time to make corrections if the returning officer finds the document is incomplete. If your nomination is rejected, you can present a new nomination paper up until the deadline. You will find the form and more details about the process on the Elections Canada website. To learn more, please take a look at our other modules and resources.
It's just nice to hear somebody talk besides me for a while, isn't it? There was a lot of information in that video, and I'm going to go through some of the most important points. But again, the resource sheet will have lots of extra details as well. Oh, don't play again. There we go. So the first 5 steps you need to do before an election is called. So like I mentioned that an election could be coming pretty soon. If this is something you're thinking about doing for the next election, I encourage you to act now. Don't delay. But first, you are going to make sure that you are indeed eligible to be a candidate in a federal election. So the video mentioned that you need to be a Canadian citizen and at least 18 years old on election day. But it also also did not include some other points, which are that you are not already an elected member of a provincial or territorial legislature. So if you're involved in provincial politics in that way, you can't do both. Also, you also can't be imprisoned in a correctional institution, and you also can't be an election officer. And that just means you can't already work for Elections Canada, because we are pretty strictly non-partisan agents of Parliament. The second step is to decide to run either as a member of a political party or as an independent candidate, which we talked all about. And then step 3 is you have to complete your nomination paper. So once you've decided your affiliation, you need to complete this nomination paper, which you can either get from our website, which is the easiest way to get it, and I'll include a link in the resource package, or you can also go to an Elections Canada office. So right before an election is called, there's a whole bunch of pop-up offices that happen in every single electoral district. And I know for a fact that the returning officers right now are getting ready to sign their leases for those offices, which means that if you'd prefer to get it in person, those offices will pop up very soon. We also have this portal online on our website. It's called PESC. I know, Gesundheit, right? So it stands for Political Entities Service Center Portal. I'm just going to call it PESC. But you can download your nomination paper from there. And it's a portal where you can interact with the process of becoming a candidate more readily. Now, step 4 is you'll have to make your team. You'll have to fill various positions. There's one position that is absolutely mandatory. It was mentioned in the video, and this is the official agent. So I'll go a little bit more into what the official agent does in the next couple of slides. But then the next step is also collecting signatures. So all candidates must collect signatures from electors who are eligible to vote. That is other Canadian citizens who are at least 18 years old on election day that live in the electoral district where they intend to run. So you don't have to live in that electoral district, but you'll need to go there to get signatures from electors. When they give you their signature, this means that they support you in running as a candidate, but it does not necessarily mean that they will vote for you. And you can find that document to collect signatures on the resource sheet as well that I will send out afterwards. Break from information for a second. Let's go to another true or false. So again, you can think about this in your head, or if you're feeling brave and you want to write it in the chat, you can. Of course, we'll make Susanna answer it because as I said so. So, true or false, you need to submit 100 signatures with your nomination paper. What do we think?
Dun, 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 dun.
You can think in your head too, or you can, anything coming up in the chat, Susanna?
Not yet. I'm going to say for myself, I was going to say yes, so that we have a false. I think it's more. So we have both sides once again.
Yeah, and this is a really tricky question. So, because it's like kind of most of the time it's true is the answer. So, I guess that technically means it's false because it's not always true. So, let me explain. In most electoral districts, you need to submit 100 signatures with your nomination paper. However, remember how I said that there are some electoral districts that are geographically quite big because they have low population density, so more rural settings. So, there are some electoral districts where you actually only need to submit 50 signatures. But one thing I will say that regardless of whether you have to hit 50 or 100, I actually recommend getting an additional at least 50 if you can, because afterwards you hand in your nomination paper to the Elections Canada worker, and we go through and check to make sure that each one of those individuals are viable. And if we find out that there are any mistakes, then you could end up being rejected. So let's say you submit 100 signatures, but then 2 of them, maybe we find out that like, oh, that was a mistake. That person's not actually 18 yet, or that was a mistake. They thought they lived in that riding and they don't. Then all of a sudden you only have 98 signatures, in which case, anyways, always better to do a little bit extra.
There is a question for clarification
Sure.
from Dean to ask. Do the signatures have to come from people in the riding you are going to run in?
Yes, that's right. They do. So do you remember I said in that example when I lived in Drumheller and there was a person who lived in Calgary who was running for the NDP in the electoral district in Drumheller. So in order for them to run, they had to come to Drumheller and collect enough signatures in that electoral district, even though they lived in Calgary.
Thank you. There's also a question from the previous slide when you were talking about, and Mike, maybe you can clarify a little bit. You were talking about the official agent on your team. Is this the same thing as a
Yeah.
campaign manager?
No, it will be different than a campaign manager. I'll get
Okay.
into some of the other positions in a second. So, oh, my cat. Some people might double up. I suppose there could be a situation where your official auditor also acts as a campaign manager. That certainly happens if you have a small team, but the duties are a little bit different and the titles are a little bit different. So I will we'll get to that slide where I go through some of the other roles in a moment. And then if you have more questions, definitely feel free to ask. Does that sound okay, Mike?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. All right. So, true or false? You can submit your nomination paper before an election is called. What do we think?
I'm going to say yes.
It's false again.
Oh,
See, this is why I like putting Susanna on the spot because I know she's a real good sport. So you want to fill out as much as you can before the election is called, but you can't hand in your nomination paper until the election is called. And we'll get more into that in a moment.
okay. So you can be ready to go, but you
Yes.
can't do it until it's called. Thank you.
Yes, it's true. So let's get more into the official agent. And then there's another role called an auditor. So one is mandatory, which is the official agent. And then the auditor only becomes mandatory if your campaign gets a little bit bigger. So let's talk about what that means. So, the official agent, the mandatory one, you cannot become a candidate without filling this role. The official agent takes care of your campaign's finances, including donations and expenses, and reports everything to Elections Canada. So, this is completely a security position that helps ensure your integrity as a candidate. Their job continues until the campaign fulfills all of its financial reporting requirements. And they have a lot of responsibility, including authorizing any advertising for your campaign. Now, you need to appoint an official agent before you accept any contributions, loans, or transfers, before you spend any money on campaign activities, and before you file your nomination papers, which happens when the election's called. So, this is a person that you want to set up at the exact same moment that you are deciding, yes, I want to be a candidate. So, and then there's a second position called an auditor. So this is a position that you can fill before the election as well. And this person examines your financial records. The auditor is only mandatory if your campaign reaches the following milestones. So if you receive $10,000 or more in contributions, if you spend $10,000 or more in expenses, and if you get at least 10% of the total votes in your electoral district. So not every campaign reaches these milestones, but if they do, that auditor there is there, again, for security to make sure you're upholding your integrity as a candidate. There's lots of security checks along the way.
Can I ask
There's
a
also,
question? Can I
yeah,
ask a
yeah.
question? Are there people out there, they're like, hey, I'm an official agent. You can hire me. Like, how does that even, like, how does that happen? How do you choose someone or how do you know it's the right person?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you go through, if you are representing a party, what is the most likely scenario is that they will have people that they have advocated to be official agents and have gone through the party process. And then you will likely use one of the official agents that the party sets aside for you. If you are running independently, it's entirely your job to find these people yourself. So this might mean that you go out and you're hiring somebody that maybe they act as an official agent once for a party, but they're no longer doing that anymore. Or all of these positions, because they're outlined, the regulations are outlined in exactly what they need to do, when they need to do it, etc. It could really be anybody that you feel like has the capacity to learn and take on these tasks too. Does that help at all?
Yes, that does. My next question is, do they have to have any kind of certification or certain training in order to be that role?
So they don't necessarily have to have certifications or training, but the regulations are set out on our website. So we have modules and training that once somebody is an official agent, they can work through our workbooks and some of our modules to make sure that they are indeed doing their jobs correctly. But they don't necessarily have to. But the downside is if they don't do their job correctly, then you might not be allowed to run as a candidate, or you might incur some fines for breaking the law in that way. But I have seen and heard of cases where somebody is run and it's their buddy, somebody that doesn't necessarily have a special financial experience, but they were keen enough to go through the modules online that they were able to teach it to themselves.
Got it.
Mhm.
We do have a question in the chat from Mike. An example. If you know a John Smith who is an auditor or an official agent for a party, but I want to run as an independent, can I still hire John?
So they would be acting as an official agent for two different candidates. Is that the scenario?
Yes.
Oh, I actually don't know the answer to that.
Well, no, not necessarily. Like they would be acting as an official agent for the party, but I want to hire them as an independent. Can they work for me even though they are kind of, I guess, chosen by the party?
That's a good question. So I'm not entirely sure, but I'm happy to follow up on this and get some answers back to you when I send out the resource package as well. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. Lots of good questions today. I'll get back to you. Okay, now I want to be mindful of the time because we're nearing about 10 minutes to the end of this presentation, and I still have a few slides to go through. So if it's okay, if we can just pause our questions until the end, and I promise I'm happy to stick around and chat and answer all of them, but I just want to make sure I can get through all the content in case folks have to leave in about 10 minutes. Okay, so let's say the election is called, then you submit your nomination paper because now we all know that's when it happens. And then Elections Canada goes through all the paperwork. And as long as everything is in order, they confirm your nomination. So once the election is called, there's anywhere from 36 to 50 days before Election Day. So you have until 20 days before Election Day to submit your nomination paper. Because that way, if Elections Canada come back and says, oh, there's a mistake here, or this wasn't filled out correctly, or you need to do this, then you still have a little bit of time to submit your correct paperwork. But there is that cutoff, and I always recommend doing it sooner rather than later. So then we're going to talk about what happens. Like now you've submitted your nomination paperwork. We've confirmed, yep, you are a candidate. And what do you do now? So as promised, you assemble the rest of your team. So none of these are mandatory, and depending on the work you want to take on, how big of a campaign you ultimately will have, you will determine which of these positions do you want. So the first is a campaign manager, which builds the team, manages volunteers, sets financial goals, organizes events and outreach, and supports the candidate. You might have your signage team, that seeks permission to put up signs, install, repair, and replace signs. And generally, this team is made up of volunteers. You might have your canvas team, which goes door to door on your behalf, keeps records, makes phone calls, and follows all the rules to keep sending out communications with electors in your electoral district. You might have your office manager, manages all your offices. You might have your event organizer. So if you want to have any kind of rallies in your electoral district, that might be someone who sets that up on your behalf. You also might have a candidate representative. So these are not mandatory, but they go out to the polling places on election day to act as scrutineers. So they are allowed to observe the polling places to ensure that Elections Canada is fulfilling all of their duties and there's nothing partisan going on. And they also can watch the vote count. Now, as a candidate, you will also want to think about your community outreach strategies and effective ways to connect with electors. These might be ways to share your election platform and your reasons for running as a candidate and to fundraise. And it could be anything from getting a list of the electors in your electoral district to call or door knock, to general advertising like commercials, for example, to putting up campaign signs, to calling, texting, or emailing electors, or holding in-person events. Okay, trivia. This one we're going to think in our head just because we're running low on time. In what year was the Canada Elections Act changed to improve the accessibility of election campaigns for people with a disability? So, is it A, 1995, B, 2013, C, 2024, or D, 2019? So, if you're thinking 2019, then you would be right. I wish I could say it was earlier. But one thing that I love about working for Elections Canada is it's very active and transparent in the advocacy for people who experience barriers to the electoral process. So we are constantly consulting and working with communities to make sure that we know what are these barriers and what can we do as an organization to reduce them. So running an accessible campaign, hopefully, maybe, might be something that you consider when you run as a candidate. So to create a more inclusive campaign, we hope that you would consider, as we talked about, using plain language on all communications wherever possible in your messages to the voters, to provide information in accessible formats such as large print and braille to make it easier for people with visual impairments to engage, to ensure that your website follows accessibility standards, to post accessible videos and images on social media so that people with hearing or visual impairments can still engage with your content, to choose accessible locations when you have events, to be inclusive and have a diverse campaign team, to campaign in both official languages or even some of the languages that maybe are more strongly represented in your electoral district, or to ensure sign language, for example, is available during your debates and your events. Now, you may be reimbursed for some of the expenses used to make your campaign accessible. I love telling people about this. Anytime that there's communication between a party, a candidate, or campaign and an elector, there could be an accessibility expense. And you can get reimbursed 90% to a maximum of $5,000 for eligible accessibility expenses. So what is eligible is a lot of what I just listed, and will also be available on the resource package that I sent out. Additionally, if you are a candidate with a disability, you can request reimbursement for up to 90% of certain disability-related personal expenses to help you run your campaign. So let's say you are deaf or hard of hearing, and you would like to have an ASL interpreter with you as you go about your campaign. That would be included as personal expenses related to your disability and care for yourself. So there's a full list on what all of these accessibility related expenses that can be reimbursed on the resource sheet that I'll hand out. Now, the last section, I want to talk about electoral security. So these are the things that we have to ensure that we uphold the integrity of Canadian elections. So We mark and count paper ballots by hand. We do not have electronic voting, and we do not have electronic vote counters. The ballot counts are done, as we mentioned, with scrutineers. We are very transparent, and once election day finishes and the polling places shut down, there's a whole group of people that count the votes and a whole group of people that watch the vote count. And anyone is eligible to do that, like you. If you want to watch the vote count, you can go to your polling place in your electoral district at the end of election day and watch the vote count. All the vote counts are happened by paid election workers, and they follow a pretty strict policy and procedures on how to do so. And all of the results are then reported to head office. And though we have preliminary results are often available within a few hours after the last polling place closes, there is a period of a couple of months where certain paid and trained security officers, if there's any sort of security concerns, they can go through the process to make sure that if there's any mistakes, if there's any concerns from the public or scrutineers, that those can be investigated within a couple of months after the election. There's also, as I talked a lot about through this presentation, different security measures for political financing, spending, and advertising. So a lot of these rules are to ensure that people can have their campaigns are assessed more fairly among the public. So like I talked about, that just because someone might have more of their own personal money available to them, that shouldn't put them at an advantage compared to somebody else. All parties have to fundraise, all parties have to report their finances and their means for which with they connect with voters and they campaign. All right, good. I want to make sure I had a few moments for questions. This QR code I will leave up here. So if you feel like scanning it and letting me know how I did today, I definitely love your feedback. I use everything to try to make these presentations as accessible as possible. This is my email address. And when I send out the answers to the questions I got and the resource guide and the presentation to Susanna, you will also have my email that way. And I encourage you to reach out anytime. It is what I'm here for. Whew, so we did it. Thank you so much for being with me through this presentation. Are there any questions at this time? I'll leave up the screen just for a moment in case people are still scanning, and then I'll stop sharing so I can see you all.
Thank you. That was really well done, getting us in right in time. Really appreciate that. One question that did come up earlier was, if you're part of a party, there's usually a convention or an AGM. Is this a good time to come together as a party and figure out your platform? Do independents have something similar?
Oh, interesting. So I'm actually not allowed to comment too strongly on what each political party does. I am super strictly nonpartisan. I do know that a lot of the political parties are a little bit different with how they manage things. So ultimately, I recommend reaching out to the party, like going to their website and through their contact form, or if there's a member of parliament that represents that particular party that you hope to represent, I recommend reaching out to them individually because they'll be able to give you the most accurate information. Now, with independent candidates, I actually have not heard of any sort of organizing body that where they get together in that way. So no, not something that I've heard of yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
And
yeah,
so,
I was just curious because for some reason I thought that having like an AGM or something was actually part of the process. I thought you had to have one as
oh, I might have misunderstood the question. So with independents, yes, you will have to have an AGM with your team, but not with the other independents. I think that's where I got hung
Oh,
up.
no. Sorry, that's not what I meant. Yeah, no.
I see.
I meant
Thanks for the
with those people,
clarification.
kind of. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks,
Cool. I
Mike.
also see a question here in the chat. Can
Mhm.
you begin collecting signatures before an election is called, or do you need to wait for this part as well? I encourage you, don't wait. If this is something you're considering, on our website and in the package I send out, you will see the nomination package that includes all the forms to get signatures. I encourage you to start as soon as you know that this is something you'd like to do, in case it takes longer than you're expecting. So then as soon as the election is called, your paperwork is ready.
Great point.
Anything else?
If there isn't anything that's coming up right away, I'm going to stop recording for the moment and say thank you, Jessica, so much for that thorough presentation and all the information, as well as for everyone here to come and participate. Jessica's putting her email in the chat there. I will also be sending out a little feedback survey. It's from our third-party auditor that's looking at the mentorability initiative to see what's working and what can be changed to make things better. So really appreciate your feedback. If you would, we won't see any of that either. That's completely anonymous, and then they'll take all of that and provide a report for Mentorability Canada. If there's any feedback that you would like to provide to me directly, I'm always open to all and every kind of feedback. It helps us grow. So thank you everyone for being here. I'll stop recording and then stay on the line for just a little bit longer. Thank you again, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for being such an engaged audience too. It's so rare that I run out of time from having so many questions, and that is a problem I want to have.
Wonderful.